for having me. It's lovely to meet you.
Introduce us to Nu, or Ned Kelly.
Nu is a young woman. We meet her, she's in her early 20s, and she's a member of the New South Wales Police Force. And her father was an Australian soldier in Vietnam, her mother was Vietnamese. And by joining the New South Wales Police Force, her full name is Ned Kelly. The police cannot pronounce her name either, and with her initials of N. Kelly, she becomes Ned.
So where is Ned at the beginning of the new book, Beams Falling?
So at the beginning of Beams Falling, chronologically it's set only a few weeks after the events of the old school, but the books stand self-contained. You can read one without the other. But at the end of the old school, there was a very violent incident involving Ned, and she was wounded physically and mentally. So we pick her up in this book recovering physically and mentally. She was shot, and so she's trying to get back to work because for her that's normality, to try and get back to her job. But physically she's not quite well, but she manages to get back into work on what in the police force is called light duties or restricted duties.
Even though she's on light duties, though, her colleagues don't cut her much slack. I mean, there's a very mixed kind of feeling of supporting her and sort of almost sabotaging her or undercutting the support at the same time. Is that something that you noticed in the police force?
Light duties in the police force is quite a sort. It was, I should say. I probably should say I got out in the mid-90s, and one would hope that things are a lot more enlightened these days. But in those days, to be on light duties meant that you were like not earning your keep. You were waiting the saddlebags. You can't really. You're not able to do all the work, but you're still there. You're taking up a position. Quite a lot of people that are on extended sick leave, they're not there, but you can't replace them. So everybody else is having to work that little bit harder to cover them. And of course, if your light duties result from a physical injury, well, that's one thing. If your light duties result from stress, that was, in the time, really seen as people trying to probably game the system to get out.
Because that's what you're really dealing with so well in this book, is that you paint a picture of an officer who is basically suffering from post-traumatic stress in the same way as a soldier returning from combat. And I get the feeling of Nu being immensely troubled still. She's replaying awful things in her mind. She's reaching for her gun too quickly. Yeah. She's also terribly lonely and isolated as a figure, isn't she?
Yes. And that was something I could sort of experience when you were a police woman. I joined in 1982. The force was still very much weighted with males. And it was only quite recently that women were able to, in those days, join the proper police force. Prior to that, they used to join something called the Women Police Office, where they lectured and did school crossings, and a select few assisted detectives when they had to search prostitutes. That was sort of basically the limit of their range. So you did sort of feel a bit isolated, even when you were accepted as one of the boys. You weren't really one of the boys. For her, she has that, plus she now has this added layer of, with post-traumatic stress disorder, you trust no one. You don't trust yourself, you don't trust your family. So your family, they know too much about you, so you try and distance them. Strangers, you don't trust at all. So I thought for her, she was, in this book, she's transferred out of her support network, which was Bankstown Detectives, and she's sent to a new place. And she's completely psychologically ill-equipped to cope with that kind of move at that point, because she is unable to trust anyone.
And that new place is Cabramatta, and that's a particularly ironic and interesting place for you to send her, because of course, being Vietnamese, her nationality should be an asset, except that it's not an asset in the ways you might expect, because, for example, she doesn't speak Vietnamese.
No, I mean, she's an Australian father, a Vietnamese mother, born and raised in Sydney, has not grown up in a Vietnamese cultural family, and does not speak the language. And it's sort of confronting those stereotypes that we have of, well, if that's your face, then you must naturally speak this. And of course she doesn't. And it was interesting, after the first book, a lot of people said to me, so, in the second book, do you intend to take her back to Vietnam on a search for her roots? And I thought, well, no, was never a plan. But also, this is early 1993. Vietnam is only just opening up to tourism and these sorts of things. And I just thought, no, that's not her story. She'll go to Cabramatta and face the Vietnamese community that's here and that have had a completely different experience to her. As she grew up in this safe community. The people, she now has post-traumatic stress disorder from a violent incident that occurred in the line of her work, but she's gone to a community where pretty much anyone in that community who has come as a refugee has been traumatised.
Exactly.
And now she's dealing and having to work within a completely traumatised community as well.
And they're also a community where the crime involves drug trafficking. So we know that Cabramatta became a kind of epicentre, don't we, of the heroin trade. So tell me a little bit about how you researched the Cabramatta crime scene to give it the flavour and authenticity that you do give it.
One of my last postings in the police force was actually Drug Enforcement Agency, and this was the early 90s, and we did a lot of work on heroin, but the Drug Enforcement Agency was an interesting place. The part of it that I worked in was called the support unit, and we pretty much supported the undercover unit, so they would be going out, they would make friends with people over a period of weeks or months, and then try and set up a very large buy, and then we would go along to sort of assist on the arrest. Other parts of the DEA, and I mean, when you look back on it, well, even today, so much of it was sort of ethnically based crime squads. You had one crime squad because, at one point there, the Romanians were the huge heroin dealers, so there was a crime squad devoted to looking at Romanians. You had a crime squad devoted to looking at Asians. It was ironic in a bad way that some of these crime squads did not have any native speakers on them, which was extraordinary. And what the police force did at that time was actually bring out some cops from Royal Hong Kong Police Force and from Royal Hong Kong ICAC to work on the Asian crime squads. And I remembered, because they were very secret, these task forces that were given numbers, worked in secret locations. We didn't even know where they were, but sometimes they'd turn up in our office. And I remember at one point seeing them turn up with these Asian guys, these Chinese guys, middle-aged men, and it's like, who are they? And we've brought them out from Hong Kong. So I never really knew what happened to those guys. So one of the people that, I worked occasionally in Cabramatta. We would just go out to do very quick and dirty buys. Someone would be complaining about drugs at the railway station. We might spend a day out there and you'd snap up a few people and, totally ineffectual kind of stuff. But I thought, I wonder what happened to these guys from Hong Kong. Because this is pre the Hong Kong handover back to China. So there were, at that point in Australia, we were getting a lot of Hong Kong immigrants that could basically, if you were a business person from Hong Kong and you had a big whack of money that you were prepared to invest in Australia, we were very happy to see you. So I thought, well, for these coppers, this must have been an amazing opportunity to come to Australia. So I ended up talking to Clive Small, who was an assistant commissioner and actually worked on the Newman murder and worked in Cabramatta. And I spoke to him a lot. He's written some wonderful books about that period, Smack Express. And I said, what happened to these guys from Hong Kong? Did the New South Wales Police Force keep them? And he said, no, they all eventually went back home because there was a human resources stuff up and the police force weren't able to work out how to translate their superannuation and long service leave. So it would have meant they'd have sacrificed it and they weren't prepared to give them more, so they all went home. So I just thought, that's too good a story not to include. So,
Pam, what about police corruption? Is it just a fact of life?
I think anywhere where you have vast sums of money moving around because of the criminalisation of certain, substances, whether it's alcohol during Prohibition or drugs as it is now, or prostitution, when you create that sort of backdrop and vast sums of money, it's almost impossible to think that it won't occur. The systems that the police have in place now, post the Royal Commission, with what they call integrity testing, where if somebody is suspected, they might actually set up a situation that pretty much tempts them. Mm-hmm. And this is probably the best that you can hope for in creating an atmosphere of total unacceptability. Because it's interesting, and one of the things I'd like to explore in books to come, because this book finishes halfway through 93, and of course in 95, 96 in New South Wales we have the Wood Royal Commission. But one of the things that sort of tilts over, and which I sort of start to play with that idea in this book, is that moral grey area, which there was a lot of talk of this noble cause corruption.
Yes. That
police, they might step over the line because otherwise the bad guys get away with it. And yes, you're playing a little bit rough, but it's for a good cause. Mm. And once that line is crossed, or you start to work in that moral grey area, then what's next? What's next? What's next?
Given that New is so isolated and that this is such a stressful and dangerous and difficult job, it really struck me, reading the book, I just thought, why would any woman want to join the police force? Yeah. Now, I know this book is set in the past. Do you think that things have changed so that if you were a young woman today embarking on a career of public service, would you want to become a detective today? Would you want to join the police force? Would you be happy, if you had a daughter, for her to join the police force?
It's hard to say. I think things have changed, and I think it's really important that good people do the job. So if somebody is motivated enough to want to do it, then I think the last thing you could say to them is don't, because that's obviously exactly the right person to be doing the job. It's the nature of the work itself as well that is just so, for me, that I found just so wearing. I think certain personality types cope better than others. If you're like an alpha personality that really wants to dominate every situation you're in, you're going to go well, because police work at its basic level ends up being two people sitting opposite each other across the room, only instead of me being here quite happy to talk to you about my book, it's me being here having something that the last thing I want to do is actually tell you about it, and you trying to get me to tell you.
There's also violence, there's tremendous physical risk and danger.
Yeah. I mean, I remember at the time thinking if I'd been an American I wouldn't have joined a police force because of that level of violence in America, the level of gun carry, the level of gun crime. That, for me, I just thought, no, I think being in the cops in America would be too dangerous a job.